In the days that followed the breaking of the fellowship and the fall of Isengard, when the fires of war had dimmed but were not yet wholly quenched, there came to Minas Tirith tidings most strange and dire. The messenger was one Hurin of Ithilien, a ranger who had served under Faramir in the secret wars against the enemy, and his face bore the pallor of one who has looked upon things that mortal eyes were not meant to behold. "My lord steward," spoke he unto Denethor, though his voice trembled as autumn leaves before the gale, "there are stirrings in the east, beyond the Black Gate, where naught should stir save the carrion birds and the winds of desolation. 3 nights past, as I kept watch upon the borders of the Daggerlad, I beheld lights that were not stars, and heard voices that spoke in no tongue of Middle-earth." Now, Denethor was in those days already touched by the madness that would be his doom. Yet was he still keen of wit in matters of war and peril. "What manner of lights, Ranger? Speak plainly, for in these times all signs must be weighed and measured." "They were as pale flames that danced without fuel, my lord, and they rose from the very stones of the Morannon itself. And the voices." Here Hurin faltered, and his hand went to his sword hilt as though seeking comfort. "The voices sang of things that were, and things that are, and things that yet may come to pass. They spoke of a door that was not closed, though all the world believes it sealed." At these words, a shadow fell upon the hall, though the sun yet shone bright without. For Denethor knew well the histories of the Black Gate, how it was built by the Dark Lord in days of old to guard the passes of the Ephel-Duath and the arid Lithui. Yet he knew also that its making was but part of a greater design, one whose full purpose had never been fathomed by the wise. "Summon the guard captains," commanded Denethor, "and send word to Osgiliath that the watch upon the borders must be doubled. If there is truth in what you say, then the peace we have won may prove but a brief respite before storms yet greater than those we have weathered." But even as the steward gave these commands, far to the north, in the halls of Thranduil, in the woodland realm, another had received tidings that echoed strangely with those brought by Hurin. For there had come to the Elven King's court a company of his people who had wandered far in the eastern reaches of Mirkwood, beyond even the bounds of the Wood Elves' realm, and their leader was one Galion, who had served long as the king's butler, but was also skilled in woodcraft and the reading of signs. "My king," said Galion, bowing low before the carved throne of Thranduil, "we have seen that which troubles us greatly. In the eastern deeps, where the shadow of the lonely mountain falls longest, we came upon ruins of great antiquity, older even than the realm of Gil-galad, and among these ruins we found signs that someone, or something, had been there before us, and recently." Thranduil's fair face grew stern, for the Wood Elves had ever been guardians of the secrets of the forest, and few things escaped their notice. "What signs were these, Galion? And what manner of ruin?" "The ruins were of black stone, my lord, worked in patterns that hurt the eye to follow. They spoke to me of the craft of Mordor, yet they were older than Sauron's reign in that land. As for the sign," here Galion's voice dropped to a whisper, "footprints there were, but not of orc or man. They were small, as those of a child, yet the stride was long and purposeful, and where they passed, the very earth seemed chained, as though some great heat had touched it." In that same hour, though neither Denethor nor Thranduil yet knew it, a third sign was manifesting far to the west, in the Grey Haven, where Círdan the shipwright kept his eternal vigil by the sea. For there had come to the harbors a ship out of season, its sails gray as the twilight, and its hull made of wood that none could name. Upon its deck stood a figure robed in white, yet the white was not pure, but tinged with shadow, like snow that has lain too long upon the ground. The figure spoke no word as the ship drew near to the quays, but raised one pale hand in greeting, and at that gesture the very gulls fell silent, and the waves ceased their endless murmur, as though the sea itself held its breath. Then the figure stepped onto the pier, and where its feet touched stone, there appeared marks, like unto burning, though no fire was seen. Círdan himself came forth to meet this strange visitor, for he sensed in it a power both ancient and alien. "Welcome, traveler," said he, though his hand rested upon the sword at his side. "From what shore do you come, and what business have you in the Grey Havens?" The figure raised its head, and beneath the hood could be seen a face that was fair to look upon, yet terrible in its perfection, like a star that has burned too bright and too long. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of distant thunder, beautiful yet filled with menace. "I come from shores that you have not seen, Círdan the Wise, though your ships have sailed far upon the waters of the world. I come seeking that which was lost when the Black Gate fell, and that which yet may be found by those with eyes to see." "And what was lost?" asked Círdan, though his heart misgave him at the question. "A key," replied the figure simply, "a key to doors that should remain closed, yet may not. For know this, shipwright, the Black Gate was not merely a fortress and a passage, it was a seal, set in place by powers greater than those who built it, to contain that which must not be released, and that seal is weakening." With these words, the figure turned and walked back toward its ship, leaving Círdan standing upon the pier with questions burning in his mind like brands. But before the vessel had passed beyond the harbor, the shipwright called out across the water, "What name do you bear, and by what authority do you speak of these things?" The answer came back faint across the waves, yet clear enough to freeze the blood in Círdan's veins. "I am Arundel the Mariner, and I speak with the authority of one who has seen the ending of all things." And with that, the gray ship vanished into the mists that ever shroud the western sea, leaving behind only the echo of its passing and the smell of strange spices that lingered in the air like the memory of dream. Thus began the days that would be remembered as the time of echoes, when the very stones of Middle-earth seemed to whisper of secrets long buried, and the wise began to perceive that the victory over Sauron might have been but the first movement in a symphony of doom whose final notes had yet to sound. 7 days after the strange visitation at the Grey Haven, riders went forth from Minas Tirith, bearing the seal of the steward and messages sealed in black wax. These riders took the swiftest horses in the stables of the White City, and their destination was the court of King Elisar in the northern realm of Arnor, where the returned king held council in the halls of Annúminas, lately restored to their ancient glory. When the chief of these messengers, one Bergil son of Beregond, knelt before Aragorn in the great hall that looked out upon the blue waters of Lake Evendim, his words were few but weighted with urgency. "My lord king, the steward of Gondor requests your immediate presence in Minas Tirith, for there are tidings that concern the safety of all the free peoples of Middle-earth." Aragorn, who in the months since his coronation had grown into the full majesty of his kingship, studied the messenger with eyes that had learned to read the hearts of men. "What manner of tidings, Bergil? Speak plainly, for between Gondor and Arnor there should be no secrets." "I know not the full tale, my lord," replied Bergil, "but this much I may say. It concerns the Black Gate, and signs that suggest our victory over the enemy may not be as complete as we had hoped." At these words, Aragorn's face grew grave, for he remembered well his journey to that accursed portal in the days of the War of the Ring, and the evil that had emanated from it like a poisonous breath. Without delay, he commanded that horses be made ready, and a small company prepared for swift travel, choosing for his companions only the most trusted of his knights and rangers. Yet, even as the king of Gondor and Arnor prepared to ride south, other forces were stirring in the wide world. In Lothlorien, where the Lady Galadriel had remained after the departure of her lord Celeborn for the Grey Havens, the mirror had begun to show images unbidden, visions that came not at the asking of the seer, but of their own accord. The lady stood beside the silver basin in her garden, watching as scenes played out upon the water's surface, like memories of things that had never been. She saw the Black Gate as it had stood in the days of its building, when Sauron's power was young and his malice not yet fully awakened. But in these visions, the gate was not merely a fortress, but something far more sinister, a focal point where the very fabric of the world had been stretched thin, creating a weakness that could be exploited by those who possessed the knowledge to do so. "My lady," spoke a voice behind her, and she turned to see Haldir approaching, his face troubled. "There is word from our kinfolk in Rivendell. Lord Elrond requests your counsel most urgently." "What word?" asked Galadriel, though her eyes remained fixed upon the mirror, where now she saw armies that marched beneath banners of black and silver, led by figures whose faces were hidden in shadow. "Strange dreams have come to all the Noldor in the Hidden Valley," replied Haldir. "Dreams of the elder days, when the Silmarils shone in the sky and the two trees gave light to Valinor. But these dreams are twisted, my lady, showing not the beauty that was, but the darkness that came after." Galadriel nodded slowly, for she too had felt the stirring of old memories, old fears that she had thought buried beneath the weight of ages. "Prepare my escort," said she. "We ride to Rivendell with the dawn, and send word to King Thranduil in the north. He too must be warned of what approaches." Meanwhile, in the Shire, which had known peace since the return of the four hobbits from their great adventure, strange things were beginning to happen. At first, they were small things that might have been dismissed as the fancies of an old hobbit's imagination, tools that moved by themselves in the night, fires that burned cold and gave no warmth, shadows that fell at noon when the sun stood highest in the sky. But Samwise Gamgee, who had seen much of the world beyond the borders of Hobbiton and whose eyes had been sharpened by perils faced and overcome, was not so easily deceived. When his wife Rose complained that their garden spades had been found arranged in patterns that hurt the mind to contemplate, and when the ponies in the field began to refuse to cross certain patches of ground that had never troubled them before, Sam knew that the long peace of the Shire was coming to an end. "Rosie, my dear," said he one evening as they sat by their fireside, the children abed, and the night sounds of the Shire peaceful around them, "I think perhaps it's time I took a journey. Not a long one, mind you, but I've a feeling there's things stirring that the big folk ought to know about." Rose, who had learned in their years of marriage to trust her husband's instincts in such matters, nodded gravely. "You're thinking of Master Frodo, aren't you? And the others?" "Aye," replied Sam, gazing into the flames. "I've a notion that before this business is done, we'll need all the help we can get. And there's none better at dealing with dark magics than them as have faced them before." So it was that as autumn deepened toward winter, messengers went forth from the Shire as well, seeking Merry in the halls of Brandy Hall and Pippin in the great smiles of the Tooks. And though they knew not yet what danger threatened, both of those worthies felt in their hearts the call to adventure that had first stirred them in their youth, and they made ready to answer it. In Minas Tirith, Denethor paced the topmost level of the White Tower, his palantir veiled in black cloth, but its presence a constant weight upon his thoughts. The reports that reached him daily spoke of growing unrest along the borders of Mordor, of creatures seen moving in the night that matched no description in the lore of Middle-earth, and of a coldness that seemed to seep from the very ground in places where the shadow had once been strongest. When Aragorn arrived at the citadel with his escort, Denethor met him in the Hall of Fire, and there in the presence of the captains of Gondor and the wisest of the city's counselors, the steward spoke of all that had befallen since the ending of the war. "My lord king," said Denethor, his voice heavy with the weight of dark knowledge, "I fear we have been deceived. The victory at the Morannon, the fall of Barad-dûr, the departure of the Nazgûl, all this may have been but the first act in a tragedy whose full scope we have not yet grasped." Aragorn listened in silence as Denethor recounted the reports of his rangers and the strange signs that had been observed in the lands that bordered the former realm of the enemy. When the steward had finished, the king spoke with the authority of one who had walked in darkness and returned to the light. "If what you say is true, then we must gather all our allies and all our wisdom. Send word to Rohan that Éomer king may know of this peril. Summon the princes of Dol Amroth and the lords of the southern fiefs. And most urgently of all, we must seek the counsel of the wise, Gandalf the White, if he can be found, and the keepers of lore in Rivendell and Lothlorien. "It is already begun, my lord," replied Denethor. "Even now, riders carry our summons to all the corners of the realm, but I fear that before they can return, we may have need of answers that only the most ancient among the elves can provide." Thus was set in motion the great gathering that would be remembered in later days as the Council of Reluctant Allies, for none who came to it did so with joy in their hearts, sensing as they did that the peace they had fought so hard to win was slipping away like water through their fingers, and that the true test of their strength and resolve was yet to come. When the leaves had turned to gold and crimson, and the first chill winds of winter began to blow from the misty mountains, the great hall of Elrond in Rivendell was filled with a gathering such as had not been seen since the council that decided the fate of the One Ring. Yet this assembly bore a different character, for where hope had once kindled bright, now only grim determination flickered like a candle flame in an endless night. At the head of the table sat Elrond himself, his ageless face marked by lines of care that spoke of burdens newly laid upon his shoulder. To his right sat Galadriel, Lady of Lothlorien, her eyes holding depths of memory that reached back to the morning of the world. Upon his left was Círdan, the shipwright, who had come from the Grey Havens bearing tidings that had shaken even his ancient composure. King Elisar was there, with Denethor beside him, the two rulers of Gondor united by necessity, though not by love. From the Mark had come Éomer King, his golden beard touched with premature gray, for the cares of kingship weigh heavily upon those who bear them in troubled time. Even Radagast the Brown had emerged from his long wanderings in the wild, drawn by portents he had witnessed among the birds and beasts that were his especial charge. But it was to a figure seated in the shadows at the far end of the hall that all eyes turned when the time came for the speaking of lore. For this was Elrond's chief counselor in matters of the ancient days, one whose knowledge of the elder times surpassed even that of the Lord of Rivendell himself. This was Erestor, keeper of the archives of Gil-galad, and when he rose to speak, his voice carried the weight of 3 full ages of the world. "My lords and ladies," began he, his words measured and grave, "the signs you have described are known to me, though I had hoped never to see their like again in the mortal land. They speak of a working that was begun in the depths of time, when the world was young, and the Valar walked openly upon the earth." He paused, and in that pause, the very air seemed to grow cold, as though winter had suddenly deepened. In the days before the making of the sun and moon, when the 2 trees gave light to Valinor and Melkor was yet confined in the halls of Mandos, there was wrought in secret a great work of binding. For the Valar, in their wisdom and their foresight, perceived that evil once released into the world could never be wholly destroyed, but only contained. Aragorn leaned forward, his ranger's instincts alert to the import of these words. "What manner of binding, Master Erestor? And what has this to do with the Black Gate?" "Patience, young king," replied Erestor with a slight smile. "All will be made clear. Know then that when Melkor was first cast down and bound with the chain Anganor, there was created at that same time a great seal upon the world itself, a lock set upon the doors between the circles of the world and the void that lies beyond. This seal was not made of stone or metal, but of the very substance of Ea, woven into the foundation of all that is." Galadriel's voice was soft as starlight, yet it carried clearly to every corner of the hall. "And this seal required anchors in the world of form, did it not? Places of power where the binding could take root and hold fast." "Even so, my lady," replied Erestor. 7 such anchors were made, set at the cardinal points of Middle-earth and the Undying Lands. The greatest of these was at the root of Tanicatil itself, where Manwë holds his throne. Others were placed at the foundations of the Grey Havens, at the heart of Lothlorien, where the Malern trees grow tallest, and at the source of Celebros, where it springs from the mountains. "And the others?" asked Denethor. though his voice suggested he already guessed the answer. One was set beneath the lonely mountain, where the heart fire of the earth burns brightest, continued Aristor. Another at the roots of the white tree that grows upon the citadel of Minas Tirith, though few now remember that the tree is more than symbol and ceremony. And the last was at the Black Gate, finished Círdan, his voice heavy with understanding. That is why Sauron chose that place for his fortress, is it not? He sensed the power that lay beneath, though he knew not its true nature. You speak truly, Master Shipwright, said Aristor, and now you begin to understand the true peril that faces us. For the Black Gate was not merely a fortress, it was a cork in a bottle, a weight holding down forces that should never see the light of day. When it fell, when the foundations were shattered and the towers cast down, the seal was weakened. Radagast spoke for the first time, his voice rough from long silence. The birds have been telling me of strange flights in the night, of creatures that should not exist winging through the darkness above Mordor, and the very earth sickens where their shadows pass. Aye, nodded Aristor grimly, for what was bound begins to stir, and what was sealed seeks the light. The war we fought against the Dark Lord may prove to have been but a skirmish before the true battle begins. Elrond's voice cut through the murmur of dismay that arose at these words. If what you say is true, Aristor, then we face a peril greater than any that has threatened Middle-earth since the marring of the music. What hope have we of repairing what has been broken? Little hope, my lord, if we act alone, replied the lore master. But the seals were not made by the valor alone. They required also the willing sacrifice of those who were mightiest among the children of Ilúvatar. And such sacrifice may be required again, though the cost will be terrible beyond imagining. At these words, a silence fell upon the council that was deeper than the silence of tombs. For each there present had paid already a price in the wars that had gone before, and the thought of greater sacrifice to come lay upon their hearts like lead. It was Galadriel who spoke at last, her voice clear and ringing with the authority of one who had looked upon the undying lands. Tell us then, Aristor, what must be done, for better it is to know the truth, however dark, than to walk in blindness toward the abyss. The seals must be renewed, replied the lore master, but this cannot be done by force of arms or craft of hand. It requires one who can walk between the worlds, who can speak with the voices of both the living and the dead, and who has the authority to bind powers that are older than the roots of the mountains. And where shall such a one be found? Asked Éomer, his warrior's mind already turning to practical matters. Aristor's gaze moved around the circle, touching upon each face in turn, before settling upon the empty chair that stood at Elrond's right hand. There was one among us who possessed such authority, said he slowly, but he has passed beyond the circles of the world, and the paths he walked are closed to all who remain in Middle-earth. You speak of Gandalf, said Aragorn, and his voice held both hope and sorrow. But he sailed west with the ring-bearers. How can he aid us now? Perhaps he cannot, replied Aristor, but perhaps there is another way. For the power that was his is not wholly departed from Middle-earth. It lingers in the places he blessed, in the words he spoke, and most especially in the hearts of those who knew him best and served with him in the long defeat of the Shadow. The eyes of all turned then upon the chair beside the king, where sat Samwise Gamgee, who had come from the Shire at Aragorn's summons, but had spoken little during the council. The simple hobbit flushed red at the attention, but his voice was steady as he replied, "If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, Master Aristor, then you'd better think again. I'm just a gardener from Hobbiton, and while I've seen a thing or two in my time, I'm no wizard, and I've no power to bind anything stronger than weeds with a bit of string." "You underestimate yourself, Master Samwise," said Galadriel gently, "for you have carried the ring of power, and its touch has left marks upon your spirit that will never fade. More than this, you walked with Mithrandir in the very fires of Mount Doom, and something of his nature has passed to you. "As it has to all the ring-bearers who yet remain in Middle-earth," added Elrond. "Master Meriadoc, Master Peregrine, you too have been touched by powers greater than you know." Merry and Pippin, who had arrived from the Shire scarce an hour before the council began, exchanged glances of mingled fear and determination. It was Pippin who spoke, his voice higher than usual, but firm with resolve. "Well then, if there's work to be done, I suppose we'd better get on with it, though I do wish someone would explain exactly what it is we're supposed to do." And at those words, simple though they were, a kind of light seemed to kindle in the hall, as though hope had not died, but merely slept, waiting for the proper moment to wake. For in the courage of the small and humble, the wise have ever found the strength to face the darkness, and in their willingness to stand against the storm, the foundations of the world are made secure. In the gray light of dawn following the council, when the mists lay heavy upon the vale of Rivendell, and the voices of the waterfalls seemed muted and strange, there came to the house of Elrond a visitor whose arrival had been neither heralded nor expected. The guards at the ford challenged this traveler, but their voices died in their throats when they beheld who approached, for the figure that walked toward them through the morning haze wore the semblance of one they had thought never to see again in the lands of the living. Tall was this person, garbed in robes of gray that seemed to shimmer between shadow and starlight, and upon their brow was a circlet of mithril that caught what little light filtered through the cloud. Most unsettling of all, their face bore the features of Gil-galad, the Elven King, who had fallen in the War of the Last Alliance and whose spirit had passed long ago to the halls of Mando. "Be at peace," spoke this apparition, raising one pale hand in greeting, "for I come not as enemy, but as herald of necessity. Tell your lord that one who speaks with the authority of the departed has urgent business with his council." Word was swiftly brought to Elrond, who came himself to the gates to see what manner of sending this might be. When he beheld the figure that waited there, his ageless face grew troubled, for he remembered well the features of his former king, having served at Gil-galad's side in the dark days of the Second Age. "If you are indeed Gil-galad," said Elrond carefully, "then speak to me of the day when Eglos was broken, and tell me the last words you spoke ere the flame of your spirit departed from Middle-earth." "Phew!" the figure smiled, and in that smile was both sorrow and compassion. "I spoke of the morning that would come after the night, my faithful herald, and I bade you remember that even in the darkest hour, the flame imperishable burns on. But I am not Gil-galad, though I wear his form and speak with knowledge of his deeds." "Then who are you?" demanded Elrond, his hand moving instinctively toward the sword at his side. "I am a messenger from those who watch and wait in the timeless halls," replied the figure, "and I come bearing tidings that your council must hear, for the path you contemplate leads not to victory, but to a doom more complete than any that has yet threatened the world." At these words, Elrond's expression softened slightly, for he perceived that whatever this being might be, it spoke not with malice, but with the urgency of one who brings warning of great peril. "Come then," said he, "the council is even now assembled, and if your words have merit, they shall be heard." So it was that when the lords and ladies of the free peoples gathered once more in the Hall of Fire, they found among them a figure that seemed to have stepped from the pages of the Red Book itself. Many there were who gasped in amazement, for Gil-galad's deeds were renowned in song and story, and his sacrifice at the Black Gate had passed into legend. But it was Círdan who first perceived the truth, for his eyes were the oldest there, and had looked upon many strangenesses in his long years by the sea. "This is not Gil-galad returned," said he quietly, "but rather one who has taken his shape for purposes we do not yet understand. I sense no evil in it, yet neither is it wholly of the light." The figure bowed gravely to the shipwright. "Your perception does you credit, Master Círdan. I am indeed what you would name ascending, though not of any power you have encountered before. I come from those who dwell beyond the circles of the world, yet are not of the blessed realm." "Speak then," commanded Galadriel, her voice ringing with authority. "What message do you bear?" And from whom? I come from the Watchers at the threshold, replied the messenger, those who guard the boundaries between what is and what should never be. They have observed your deliberations with growing concern, for the path you would walk leads not to the renewal of the seals, but to their complete destruction. A murmur of dismay ran through the council, but the figure raised its hand for silence. Hear me out, for time grows short, and already the cracks in reality widen with each passing hour. The seals of which Master Aristor spoke so learnedly were indeed made by the valor in the elder days, but their function is more complex than any now living understands. Then enlighten us, said Denethor, his voice sharp with impatience, for if our plans are flawed, we must know it swiftly, that we may devise others. The seals do not merely contain what was bound, explained the messenger. They also maintain the barriers between the different levels of existence. When the Black Gate fell, it was not merely a physical structure that was destroyed, but a crucial junction in the architecture of reality itself. The forces that now stir in the depths are not evil in the way you understand evil. They are chaos incarnate, the raw stuff of uncreation that existed before the music of the Ainur gave form to the world. Elrond's face grew grave as the implications became clear. You are saying that our victory over Sauron may have inadvertently weakened the foundations of AI itself. Precisely, my lord, replied the figure. And now that weakness spreads like cracks in ice, reaching toward the other anchor points. If even one more seal fail, the cascade effect will destroy not merely Middle-earth, but all the circles of the world, reducing everything to the void that was before the beginning. The silence that greeted these words was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of wind in the trees and the soft crackle of the fire upon the hearth. It was Radagast who spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. Then what hope remained? If we cannot repair the seals without destroying them, and if they continue to weaken without our intervention, are we not caught between the hammer and the anvil? There is a way, said the messenger, but it requires a sacrifice that none here may be willing to make. The seals can be stabilized, but only by one who is willing to become a living anchor, binding their very essence to the foundations of the world. What would that mean? Asked Aragorn, though his kingly heart already guessed the answer. It would mean ceasing to exist as a separate being, replied the figure solemnly. The one who undertakes this burden would become part of the fundamental structure of reality itself, conscious, but no longer able to interact with the world of form. They would be alive, yet not alive, present everywhere, yet nowhere, sustaining the barriers between order and chaos until the end of all things. Merry cleared his throat nervously. And I suppose this someone would have to be one of the ring-bearers you mentioned? Not merely a ring-bearer, corrected the messenger, but one who has touched the very heart of the music, who has stood at the threshold of both creation and destruction. In all of Middle-earth, there is only one who has walked so deep into darkness and emerged again into light. All eyes turned to Sam, who sat very still in his chair, his weathered hands folded in his lap. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. You're talking about Master Frodo, aren't you? But he's gone west, beyond the reach of any call from Middle-earth. The figure nodded gravely. Indeed, Frodo Baggins dwells now in the Blessed Realm, healed of his wounds and at peace. But there may yet be a way to reach him, though the path is perilous beyond measure, and success far from certain. What path? Demanded Galadriel, leaning forward in her chair. The straight road, replied the messenger, the path that the elven ships follow when they sail into the west. But it is not merely a road upon the sea. It is a bridge between the mortal world and the realm of the Valar, and it can be traveled in both directions by one who has the will and the knowledge to attempt such a journey. Círdan's eyes widened in understanding. You speak of the old lore, the secret ways that were hidden when the world was made round, but those paths have been closed since the fall of Númenor, and none now living knows the words of opening. None save the ring-bearers, corrected the figure, for in bearing those circles of power, they were bound to all the circles of the world, including those that lie beyond mortal sight. The knowledge sleeps within them, waiting to be awakened by desperate need. Sam stood up slowly, his face set with determination. Then it seems the choice is made. If Master Frodo is the only one who can save Middle-earth, then I'll find a way to reach him, no matter what it takes. Master Samwise, said the messenger, and for the first time its voice held a note of something approaching warmth. Your loyalty does you great credit, but the path I speak of cannot be walked by will alone. It requires not only courage, but a sacrifice almost as great as that, which would be asked of Frodo himself. What manner of sacrifice? Asked Pippin, though his voice trembled as he spoke. To walk the straight road, while yet in the flesh, one must surrender all ties to Middle-earth, save one, the bond that calls them back. All other loves, all other loyalties, all memories save those that drive them forward must be laid aside, lest they become anchors that drag the traveler down into the depths between the worlds. Rose Gamgee, who had accompanied her husband to Rivendell, though she had remained silent during the council, spoke for the first time. And what becomes of those they leave behind? What becomes of their families, their homes, their lives? The messenger turned to her with eyes that held infinite compassion. They would remember the traveler as one who died nobly in service to all free peoples. It would be as though they had never returned from the journey, for in walking the straight road while living, they would step outside the stream of time itself. No, said Rose firmly, rising to stand beside her husband. No, I won't have it. There must be another way. But Sam took her hand gently in his own, and his voice was soft as he replied, Rosie, my dear, if there was another way, don't you think these wise folk would have found it? Sometimes the only choice is between a small sorrow and a great one, and this is one of those times. There may indeed be another way, said Elrond thoughtfully, though it too carries great risk. What if the message could be sent without the messenger? What if we could reach across the waters, not with word of flesh and blood, but with word carried by wind and wave? The figure of Gil-galad shook its head slowly. Words alone will not suffice, my lord. Frodo Baggins dwells now in peace that he has earned through suffering, and he will not lightly abandon that rest for the sake of Middle-earth, which he has already saved once at great cost. Only one who shares his deepest memories, who can speak to him of love and friendship stronger than the call of peace, could persuade him to such a sacrifice. Then I'll go, said Merry suddenly, standing up with a scrape of his chair. Sam has done enough, and Rose is right. He has a family to think of. But Pip and I, we're not married. We have no children. One of us should make this journey. And I suppose you think it should be you? Said Pippin, standing as well. Well, think again, Meriadoc Brandybuck. I'm the one who looked into the Palantir. I'm the one who spoke with Sauron himself. If anyone here understands about walking between worlds, it's me. You looked into a Palantir because you were too curious for your own good, retorted Merry. That hardly qualifies you to— Peace, commanded Galadriel, and her voice rang with such authority that both hobbits fell silent immediately. This is not a matter to be decided by argument or bravery alone. The choice of who will make this journey must be made by wisdom, not by courage, however admirable. The messenger nodded approvingly. The lady speaks truly. The one who walks the straight road must be one who can speak to Frodo Baggins not merely as friend, but as one who shared his burden and understands its weight. In all of Middle-earth, there is only one who fits that description. Again, all eyes turned to Sam, who sighed deeply and nodded. I know it as well as any. But before I make any promises, I need to know something. This sacrifice that Master Frodo would have to make, becoming part of the world itself, would it truly save everything? Would it be worth the price? If he succeeds, replied the messenger, then yes, the barriers between order and chaos would be restored, and Middle-earth would endure until the end of days. But understand, Master Samwise, the burden he would bear would be beyond imagining. To be conscious, yet bodiless, present everywhere yet able to touch nothing, aware of all that transpires yet powerless to intervene, save in the maintenance of the seals themselves. It is a fate that some might consider worse than death. But he'd be saving everyone, said Sam simply. Every child in the Shire, every tree in Fangorn, every star in the sky. That's the sort of thing Master Frodo would do if he understood what was at stake. The council fell silent once more, each member wrestling with the magnitude of what was being proposed. It was Denethor who finally spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of kingship and responsibility. If this is indeed the only path that leads to hope, then we must walk it, however dark it may be. But I would know more of the practical matters. How would Master Samwise reach the Undying Lands? What ship would carry him, and by what route? Círdan stirred in his chair, his ancient eyes fixed upon some distant horizon. There is a way, said he slowly, though it has not been attempted in all the years since the world was made round. In the deepest vaults beneath the Grey Haven, there lies a ship that was built before the fall of Gil-galad, wrought with such skill and blessed with such power that it can sail not merely upon the sea, but upon the very winds of the world. It was meant to be the last ship, to be used only when all other hope had failed. And you think this is such a time? Asked Aragorn. My Lord King, replied Círdan, if the foundations of reality itself are cracking, then I can imagine no greater failure of hope than that. The messenger rose from its seat, and as it did so, the form of Gil-galad seemed to flicker and fade, replaced by something that was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but partook of all ages and genders at once. The choice lies before you, said this being, its voice now like the sound of wind through crystal caves. Will you attempt this desperate gambit, knowing that failure means not merely the death of Middle-earth, but the unmaking of all that was, is, and ever shall be? Sam looked around the circle of faces, seeing in each one the weight of decision and the shadow of fear. Then he looked at his wife, and in her eyes he saw love and understanding, and the terrible courage of one who knows that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. "Aye," said he at last, his voice steady as stone. "I'll do it. I'll sail the straight road and find Master Frodo, and I'll ask him to save the world one more time. And if he says yes—" Sam paused, swallowing hard. "If he says yes, then I suppose I'll have to say goodbye to everyone and everything I've ever loved." "Not goodbye," said Rose softly, tears streaming down her face. "Never goodbye, Sam. Just until we meet again in whatever green country lies beyond the sunset." And the die was words, and the fate of Middle-earth was set upon a path stranger and more perilous than any that had been walked since the music of the Ainur first gave form to the void. 7 days were granted for preparation, though to those who waited in Rivendell they seemed to pass like the turning of season, each hour pregnant with finality and farewell. Sam spent these days in quiet conversation with his friends and family, speaking of small things mostly, the gardens of Bag End, the children's laughter, the way the light fell upon the water in the early morning. He avoided talk of the great journey ahead, for words seemed inadequate to contain such immensity of purpose and peril. On the 3rd day, there came to Rivendell a company from Lothlorien, led by Celebdil the Fair, who bore with him a gift from the Lady Galadriel. It was a phial wrought of crystal and mithril, filled with water from the mirror and stoppered with a cork of Malorn wood. Within the water floated a single Eleanor flower, golden still, though autumn had long since passed. "My lady bids me say," spoke Celebdil, as he placed the phial in Sam's weathered hands, "that this water was drawn from the mirror on the night when she first looked upon the face of Frodo Baggins and saw in him the doom that was to come. The flower bloomed in her garden on the day he departed Middle-earth, and has remained fresh from that hour to this. Together, they hold something of the bond between you and your master, and may serve as beacon and guide when the paths grow dark." Sam turned the phial over in his hands, marveling at its lightness, and the way the golden flower seemed to pulse with inner radiance. "It's beautiful," said he simply. "Please tell the lady I'm grateful, though I fear I'm not worthy of such a gift." "Master Samwise," replied Celebdil gently, "worthiness is not measured by the size of one's deeds alone, but by the size of one's heart. And your heart, small though you may think it, has room enough within it to hold the love of all Middle-earth." On the 5th day, Merry and Pippin came to Sam with heavy hearts and a proposal that surprised him greatly. They had spoken together long into the night, they said, and had reached a decision they hoped he would accept. "We want to come with you," said Merry without preamble. "Not all the way, mind you. We understand that the final part of the journey must be yours alone. But, as far as the Grey Havens, at least, you shouldn't have to face this alone, not until you absolutely must." "That's kind of you," replied Sam, "but I thought you'd be needed here to help with whatever comes after." "There won't be any after, will there?" said Pippin quietly. "Not if you fail, and if you succeed, well, there'll be plenty of folk left to handle whatever needs handling. But there's only one Sam Gamgee, and he's been our friend through everything. We'd like to see him off properly." Sam felt tears prick at his eyes, though he tried to hide them. "Well then, I suppose that's settled. Though I warn you, it's likely to be a hard journey, and there's no telling what we might encounter along the way." "We've had hard journeys before," said Merry with a grin that was only slightly forced, "and we've always managed to see them through together." On the final day, as the sun set behind the misty mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, there was held in the hall of Elrond a feast of farewell such as the house had not seen since the departure of the ring-bearer. Yet it was a strange feast, full of silences and unspoken thoughts, where even the finest foods seemed to taste of ash, and the sweetest wines brought no joy. When the meal was finished and the tables cleared away, Elrond rose and spoke words of blessing over Sam and his companion. But it was the blessing that Galadriel gave that would be remembered longest, for she spoke in the ancient tongue of Valinor, and her words seemed to fill the hall with starlight. "Ellen Sela Lumen Omentielvo. A star shines on the hour of our meeting, but in this parting, Sam of the Shire, may all the stars of heaven light your path, and may the love that you bear and the love that is born for you be a lamp unto your feet in the darkness between the worlds." The next morning dawned gray and cold, with a bitter wind blowing from the north that spoke of winter's approach. The company that set out from Rivendell was small. Sam and Rose, Merry and Pippin, and a guard of 6 rangers led by Halbarad's son, Halrith. They traveled light, for speed was more important than comfort, and the path they took led not through the comfortable lands of Eriador, but by the old roads that ran closest to the borders of the wild. As they rode, Sam found himself looking back often at the familiar landscapes of his youth, the rolling hills where sheep grazed peacefully, the farmsteads where smoke rose from chimneys in the crisp air, the woods where autumn's last leaves clung stubbornly to bare branches. All of it seemed inexpressibly precious now, like a song heard for the last time, or a story whose ending had finally come. On the 2nd day of their journey, they encountered the first signs that all was not well in the wider world. A merchant's wagon overtook them on the road, its driver urging his horses to greater speed, despite the rough ground. When Halrith called out to ask what news from ahead, the man reined in his team and spoke with fear plain in his voice. "Strange doings in the west, my lords. Ships have been seen off the coast that sail without wind, and the fishermen report that the very sea seems chained, colder than it should be, and dark even under the brightest sun. Some say there are lights beneath the waves that pulse like heartbeats, and others claim to have heard singing that comes from no human throat." After the merchant had departed, the company rode in thoughtful silence for several leagues. It was Rose who finally spoke what they were all thinking. "It's starting, isn't it? Whatever was held back by the Black Gate, it's beginning to break free." "Aye," replied Sam grimly, "which means we'd best make all the haste we can. Every day we delay is a day closer to, well, to whatever's coming." They pushed their horses harder after that, stopping only when necessary and sleeping in the saddle when the road allowed. The landscape through which they passed seemed to grow stranger as they went westward, as though the very earth was responding to some disturbance that lay beyond the reach of mortal senses. Trees grew in unnatural pattern, their branches reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. Streams ran backwards for short stretches before resuming their proper course. And always, hanging over everything like a shroud, was a sense of watching, as though unseen eyes followed their progress from the shadow. On the fourth day, they crested a hill and saw before them the towers of the Grey Havens, rising like silver needles from the mists that perpetually shrouded the harbor. But even from a distance, they could see that something was amiss. Ships crowded the harbor as never before, not the graceful swan ships of the elves, but vessels of strange design that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "Those aren't ships of Middle-earth," said Mary uneasily. "Look at the way they sit in the water. It's as though they're not quite there." As they drew nearer to the city, they met folk fleeing in the opposite direction. Merchants and fishermen, craftsmen and farmers, all with the same haunted look in their eyes. When questioned, they spoke of dreams that came even while waking, of voices that whispered in languages that hurt the mind to hear, and of shadows that moved independently of their casters. At the gates of the Grey Havens, they were met by Círdan himself, but the ancient shipwright bore little resemblance to the composed figure who had sat in council at Rivendell. His face was drawn with weariness, and his eyes held a depth of trouble that spoke of burdens almost too great to bear. "Master Samwise," said he, clasping the hobbit's hand in both of his own, "you have come not a moment too soon. The barriers between the worlds grow thinner with each passing hour, and I fear that soon we will be powerless to aid you in your quest." "Situk, what do you mean?" asked Sam, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Come," replied Círdan, "and I will show you the ship that must carry you into the west. But know this, once you board her and sail beyond sight of land, there will be no turning back, whatever you may find in the undying land." He led them through streets that should have been bustling with the normal business of a port city, but which instead were eerily quiet, save for the sound of their own footsteps echoing off the stone. The few people they encountered hurried past without making eye contact, as though afraid that meeting another's gaze might invite some nameless doom. The harbor itself was a sight that would haunt Sam's dream for whatever time remained to. The strange ships he had seen from the hillside were indeed not vessels of any earthly make. They seemed to be constructed from crystallized starlight and shadow, their hulls translucent and ever-shifting. Creatures moved upon their decks that might once have been men or elves, but were now something altogether other, their forms wavering between solid flesh and empty air. "They began arriving 3 days ago," explained Círdan as they walked along the quays. "At first, we thought they might be refugees from some disaster in the Western Isles, but when we tried to communicate with them," he shuddered. "They speak, but their words are not words as we understand them. They are sounds that bypass the ear and strike directly at the soul, carrying meanings that no mind of Middle-earth was meant to grasp." "And the ship that's to carry me?" asked Sam, though his voice was smaller than he would have liked. "This way," replied Círdan, leading them to a dock that stood apart from the others, where a single vessel waited in solitary splendor. "Behold, Vingilote Meneluin, the foam flower of the heaven. She was wrought in the years before the shadow fell upon Númenor, blessed by Ulmo himself, and given power to sail not merely upon the waters of the world, but upon the very winds that blow between the spheres. The ship was beautiful beyond description, her hull carved from what appeared to be a single piece of white wood that seemed to glow with inner light. Her sails were woven from some fabric that shifted color with the movement of the breeze, now silver, now gold, now deep blue like the depths of the night sky. Upon her prow was carved the figure of a star, and at her stern stood a lamp that burned with a flame that cast no shadow. "She is ready to sail with the evening tide," said Círdan. "But I must warn you once more, Master Samwise, The journey you undertake is unlike any that has been attempted by mortal man. The path to the undying lands lies not merely across the sea, but across the boundaries of existence itself. You may find yourself in realms where the very laws of nature work differently than they do in Middle-earth. Sam nodded slowly, his gaze fixed upon the miraculous vessel that would carry him to whatever fate awaited. "I understand," said he. "Or at least, I understand as much as I'm able. When do we leave?" "We?" said Círdan, raising an eyebrow. "Well, I can't sail a ship like that by myself, can I?" replied Sam reasonably. "I mean, I know a bit about boats from my time on the Brandywine, but this is somewhat beyond my experience." The shipwright smiled for the first time since their arrival. "Fear not, Master Samwise. Vingilota requires no crew in the ordinary sense. She is guided by will and purpose, rather than by rope and sail. You have but to step aboard and set your heart toward your destination, and she will carry you there by paths that exist only in the space between one heartbeat and the next." As the afternoon wore on toward evening, Sam made his final preparations for departure. Rose helped him pack the few belongings he would take: the file from Galadriel, some lembas bread that would never spoil, and a small pouch of earth from his garden in Hobbiton. They spoke little during these preparations, for what words could encompass the magnitude of such a parting? When all was ready and the sun hung low in the western sky, painting the harbor in shades of gold and crimson, the time came for goodbyes. Merry and Pippin embraced their friend with tears in their eyes, promising to look after Rose and the children, and to tell them stories of their father's courage when they were old enough to understand. But it was the parting between Sam and Rose that struck all who witnessed it as something more than mortal love could compass. They held each other without speaking for a long moment, and in that silence was contained all the words that love requires, and none that it can spare. "Remember me kindly," whispered Sam at last. "Always," replied Rose, her voice steady despite the tears that streamed down her face. "And remember us when you stand before Master Frodo. Tell him that the Shire still bloomed, and that the love he bore for it lives on in every flower and every tree." Then Sam stepped aboard Vingilota, and as his feet touched her deck, the ship came alive with light that seemed to emanate from every plank and rope and sail. Círdan cast off the mooring lines, and without any perceptible motion, the vessel began to move away from the dock, gliding through the water as smoothly as a swan upon a still pond. As the gray havens fell away behind him, Sam stood in the bow, watching the familiar shore grow small and distant. The last thing he saw of Middle-earth was Rose's figure on the quay, one hand raised in farewell, growing smaller and smaller until she was lost in the gathering dusk. Then Vingilota sailed beyond the circle of the world, and Sam's great journey truly began. Upon the waters that lie beyond the sight of mortal eyes, where the very sea itself partakes more of dream than substance, Vingilota sailed with purpose born of desperate need. Sam stood upon her deck, as hours that might have been moments or years flowed past like water, watching as the familiar blue of earthly oceans gave way to hues for which no names existed in any tongue of Middle-earth. The ship moved not by wind or current, but by the force of will itself, responding to the urgency that burned in Sam's heart like a beacon in the darkness. Yet for all her miraculous nature, Vingilota could not spare her passenger from the weight of the journey's true cost. With each league that passed beneath her keel, Sam felt the ties that bound him to Middle-earth stretching thin like spider's silk in a great wind. First to fade were the simple pleasures, the taste of strawberries warm from the garden, the feel of rich earth beneath his fingers, the sound of his children's laughter echoing through the halls of Bag End. These slipped away gently, like memories of childhood dreams, leaving behind only a vague sense of loss. Next went the faces of friends and neighbors, the familiar paths through Hobbiton, the comfort of his own fireside on a winter's evening. These too departed without pain, as though they had never been more than stories told to pass the time. But when the ship began to take from him the memory of Rose's voice, of the way she hummed while working in the kitchen, of the weight of her hand in his. Then Sam cried out in anguish and gripped the ship's rail until his knuckles went white. "I won't forget her," he declared to the empty air. "Whatever the cost, I won't forget my Rose." Yet even as he spoke these words, he felt the memory slipping away like water through his fingers. Desperately, he pulled forth the phial that Galadriel had given him and stared into its crystalline depths, where the golden Eleanor flower pulsed with steady light. And in that light, he found what he sought. Not the memory of Rose's face, for that was already gone, but the essence of what she meant to him. The core of love that no distance could diminish and no magic could steal. "Not her face, then," whispered Sam, "but the love itself that I'll keep, come what may." And indeed, as the hours passed and more memories fell away like leaves in autumn, that central flame of love remained constant, growing brighter rather than dimmer as it became the sole anchor that held Sam's identity intact. He began to understand that this was the true nature of the sacrifice required, not merely to forget Middle-earth, but to distill himself down to the one essential truth that could survive the journey between the worlds. On the second day, though time itself seemed fluid in these waters, Sam began to perceive that Vingelote was not alone upon the sea. Other vessels sailed the same impossible current, ships of such strange design that the eye could not quite hold their shapes in memory. Some appeared to be built from crystallized music, their hulls resonating with harmonies that spoke of spheres beyond counting. Others seemed constructed from captured starlight, their masts reaching up into dimensions that existed perpendicular to the ordinary world. Most unsettling of all were the vessels that appeared to sail backward through time itself, their wakes stretching not behind them, but ahead, as though they carved the future from the substance of possibility. Upon the deck of one such ship, Sam glimpsed a figure that might have been himself, older and marked by sorrows not yet endured, staring back at him across the impossible waters with eyes that held all the weight of choices yet to be made. "Don't look too long upon such sights," came a voice beside him, and Sam turned to find that he was no longer alone upon Vingelota's deck. A figure stood there, tall and fair to behold, garbed in robes that seemed woven from the light of the first dawn. The paths between the worlds show many things that are, and were, and might yet be. To dwell too long upon them is to lose oneself in the maze of possibility. "Who are you?" asked Sam, though something in the stranger's manner suggested that this was a meeting that had been ordained from the foundation of the world. "I am Eowynwe, Herald of Manwë, sent to guide you through the passages that lie ahead," replied the figure, "for the journey you have undertaken is too perilous to be made alone, and the message you bear too important to be lost to the dangers of the deep." Sam studied the herald's face, seeing in it something of the same authority that had marked Gandalf, though tempered with a compassion that spoke of one who had looked upon the music of creation itself. "I'm grateful for your company," said he, "though I confess I don't understand why one such as you would be sent to aid a simple gardener from the Shire." Eowynwe smiled, and his smile was like the first ray of sunlight after the longest night. "Simplicity is often the greatest complexity, Master Samwise, and the humble heart may bear burdens that would crush the proud. You have been chosen for this task, not despite your humble origins, but because of them." As they spoke, the nature of the sea around them began to change once more. The impossible colors of the deep waters gave way to a clarity so perfect that Sam could see down through fathoms without number to a sea floor that glittered with what appeared to be fallen stars. Fish swam in those depths that were not quite fish, creatures of living light that moved in patterns too beautiful and complex for mortal minds to fully grasp. "We approach the outer borders of the Blessed Realm," explained Eowynwe. "Soon you will behold sights that no mortal eye has seen since the days when the straight road was first opened to the ring-bearer. Prepare your heart, for what you are about to witness will either exalt your spirit beyond all measure or drive you mad with the beauty of it. Indeed, As Vingilota crested the next wave, Sam beheld before him a sight that stole the breath from his lungs and brought tears to his eyes. Rising from the sea like a vision from the most sublime of dreams was the shore of Eldamar, where the light that had shone upon the two trees still lingered in every grain of sand and every blade of grass. The harbor toward which they sailed was wrought of white stone that seemed to sing in harmonies too pure for earthly ears, its quays lined with ships of such exquisite craftsmanship that they appeared to have been grown rather than built. Upon the shore, trees rose whose leaves were of gold and silver, their branches heavy with fruit that glowed like captive stars. But it was not the beauty of the landscape that brought tears to Sam's eyes, it was the figure that waited upon the quay to greet them. For there, standing in the forefront of a company of the blessed, was a figure that Sam's heart recognized, even though his mind had forgotten the beloved face. Frodo stood upon the white stones of Tol Eressëa, no longer bearing the marks of pain and weariness that had troubled him in his final days in Middle-earth. His face was bright with joy and peace, his eyes clear and unclouded by shadow. About him was gathered a company of the blessed dead, Bilbo with his eyes bright with mischief, Gandalf in robes whiter than snow, and others whose faces Sam recognized from the songs and stories of the elder days. As Vingilota drew near to the quay, Frodo stepped forward, his face bright with welcome, but touched also with concern. "Sam," he called across the narrowing water, "my dear Sam, but why have you come? The way back to Middle-earth is closed to those who reach this shore, and your time among the living should not yet be ended." Sam felt the weight of his mission settle upon him like a mantle of lead, for now came the moment he had dreaded most, the moment when he must ask the one person he loved above all others to sacrifice the peace he had so hardly won for the sake of a world that had already demanded everything from him. "Master Frodo," called Sam across the water, his voice carrying clearly in the crystalline air, "I've come because Middle-earth has need of you once more. The victory we thought we'd won has turned to ash, and without your help, everything we fought to save will be lost forever." The joy faded from Frodo's face, replaced by a look of infinite sadness and understanding. For in the blessed realm, the walls between past and future grow thin, and those who dwell there may perceive the shape of things to come as clearly as the events of yesterday. "I know why you have come, Sam," said Frodo softly, as Vingilota touched the quay, and Sam stepped onto the white stones of the immortal shore. "I have seen it in dreams that are more than dreams, and I know too what will be asked of me, and what the price will be." The two friends embraced then, there upon the quay of the blessed realm, and in that embrace was contained all the love and loss and desperate hope that had brought Sam across the impossible waters. Around them, the company of the blessed stood in respectful silence, understanding that they witnessed a moment upon which the fate of all the circles of the world might turn. "Will you do it?" whispered Sam, his voice breaking with emotion. "Will you come back with me and save everything one more time?" Frodo held him at arm's length and looked deep into his eyes, seeing there not merely the love of a faithful friend, but the reflection of every soul in Middle-earth who looked to them for salvation. "Aye, Sam," said Frodo quietly. "I'll do it, though it means giving up the peace I've found here, though it means taking upon myself a burden that will never end. I'll do it. For how could I do otherwise when you've come so far to ask it of me?" And with those words, the die was cast, and the fate of two worlds hung in the balance as they prepared to make the return journey to a Middle-earth that might already be beyond all hope of saving. In the crystal halls of Tol Eressëa, where time moves differently than in the mortal world, and the very air shimmers with the residue of the music that shaped all things, there was held a council more solemn than any that had convened since the breaking of the world. Around a table wrought from a single pearl of enormous size sat the wisest of those who dwelt in the blessed realm, Elrond and Galadriel, who had sailed west in the years following the War of the Ring, Gandalf in his true form as Olorin of the Maiar, and others whose names were sung in the oldest songs of the Eldar. At the head of the table sat one whose presence filled the hall with light that had no source, before whom even the mightiest of the Eldar showed reverence. This was Manwe Sulimo, Elder King of Arda, Lord of the breath of the world, and it was he who spoke first, when all had gathered. "Frodo of the Shire," said the Elder King, his voice like wind through mountain peaks. "You have dwelt among us now for 7 years by the measure of Middle-earth. And in that time you have tasted the peace that is the reward of those who bear great burdens faithfully. Yet now you would cast aside that peace and take upon yourself a burden greater still. Why?" Frodo, who sat small and seemingly fragile among these mighty ones, raised his eyes to meet those of the Elder King without flinching. "Because, my lord, peace that is bought with the suffering of others is no true peace at all. If my rest comes at the cost of all I held dear, then it is but a beautiful dream built upon a foundation of ashes." "Wisely spoken," replied Manwe with approval. "Yet you should understand fully what is asked of you before you make your choice irrevocable. Olorin, reveal to him the true nature of the burden he would bear." Gandalf rose from his seat, but he was no longer the gray pilgrim who had walked the roads of Middle-earth, nor even the White Rider who had led the forces of light in their final battle. Here in the Blessed Realm, his true nature was revealed. He was a flame of fire, a spirit of light and air, who had put on flesh only for the sake of his mission to the mortal lands. "My dear Frodo," said he, his voice resonating with harmonies that spoke of powers beyond mortal comprehension, "the task that awaits you is not merely to repair what has been broken, but to become yourself a part of the fundamental structure of reality. You would be transformed into something that is neither living nor dead, neither fully present nor wholly absent. Your consciousness would become one with the barriers that hold chaos at bay, and you would feel every tremor that threatens the stability of the world until the end of all things." Frodo listened in silence, his face grave but unafraid. "And what of Middle-earth itself? What would happen to the people there if I refused?" It was Elrond who answered, his voice heavy with the weight of foresight. "The cracks in reality would continue to widen. Within a year, perhaps less, the barriers between order and chaos would fail completely. The very substance of Middle-earth would begin to unravel, not merely destroying life, but erasing it so completely that it would be as though it had never existed at all. And if I accept, then the barriers would be renewed and strengthened beyond their original power," replied Manwe. "Middle-earth would endure not merely until the end of this age, until the remaking of the world itself. All who dwell there, every man and woman, every child, every growing thing, would live out their natural span in peace and safety." Galadriel leaned forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But understand, dear one, that this sacrifice would be final and absolute. There would be no rest, no peace, no release from your vigilance until Eru himself brings about the second music that will remake all things. You would become as one of the Valar themselves, but bound forever to your task." Sam, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "Begging your pardon, my lords and ladies, but what does Master Frodo himself want? I mean, it's all very well to talk about duty and sacrifice, but he's the one who'd have to bear the burden." All eyes turned to Frodo, who sat quietly for a long moment, his gaze fixed upon his hands where they rested on the pearl table. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "In the Shire, when I was young, my old gaffer used to tell stories about the great storms that would sometimes come sweeping down from the north. He'd say that the wise hobbit didn't ask whether the storm was fair or unfair. He simply did what needed to be done to protect his family and his neighbors." He raised his eyes to look around the circle of faces. "This is such a storm, isn't it? One that threatens not just the Shire, but everything and everyone I've ever loved. How can I do anything but what needs to be done?" "Then you accept?" asked Manwe gently. "I accept," replied Frodo simply, "though I would ask one boon, if it may be granted." "Speak it," Let Sam return to Middle-earth before the transformation is completed. Let him go back to his rose and his children, to live out his days in the peace that this sacrifice will purchase. He has already given more than enough for the sake of the world." Sam started to protest, but Frodo held up a hand to silence him. "No, my dear Sam. You followed me through fire and darkness, across impossible waters, and into the very heart of paradise itself. But this last path I must walk alone. It's not a road that friendship can make easier. Indeed, it would only make it harder to bear." Manwë nodded slowly. "It shall be as you wish. The faithful servant shall return to his reward, and the burden-bearer shall take up his eternal watch. But know this, Frodo Baggins, though you will be alone in your vigil, you will not be forgotten. Your name will be remembered and honored as long as any children of Ilúvatar draw breath." "That's comfort indeed," replied Frodo, with a smile that was only slightly sad. "Though I confess I hope they'll remember Sam's part in all this as well. None of it would have been possible without him." The preparations for the return journey took 3 days, though in the timeless realm of the blessed, those days might have been minutes or years. Frodo spent the time in quiet contemplation, walking the shores of Eldamar, where the waves sang lullabies older than the mountains of Middle-earth. Sam accompanied him on these walks, and they spoke of many things, of the Shire and the friends they had left behind, of the adventures they had shared, and of the strange paths that had led them to this moment. On the final day, as they stood together watching the sun set over the western sea, in a blaze of colors for which no earthly names existed, Frodo turned to his dearest friend with eyes that held all the love and gratitude that words could never encompass. "Sam," said he quietly, "there's something I need you to know. All those years ago, when I left Middle-earth, I thought I was running away from pain and responsibility. I thought I was choosing the easy path. But now I understand that everything, the journey to Mordor, the carrying of the ring, even the suffering that drove me to seek healing in the West, all of it was preparation for this moment." "I know, Mr. Frodo," replied Sam, his voice thick with emotion. "I think I've always known, somewhere deep down, you were meant for something greater than the rest of us could even imagine." "Not greater, Sam, just different. But whatever I was meant for, I could never have reached it without you. You were the strength that carried me when my own failed, the light that guided me when all seemed dark, the love that reminded me what was worth saving. If I can bear this burden, it's only because you taught me how." They embraced then, one final time, there on the shores of paradise, with the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. And in that embrace was contained all the love that had sustained them through their darkest hours, all the friendship that had made their impossible journey possible, and all the hope that their sacrifice would not be in vain. When the dawn came, it was time for Sam to depart. Vingilota waited at the quay, her sails already filled with the wind that would carry him back across the impossible distances to Middle-earth. But now he would not travel alone. Eowyn himself would accompany him, to ensure that he reached his destination safely and to bear witness to what was to come. As Sam stepped aboard the miraculous vessel, he turned back to see Frodo standing on the white stones of the harbor, no longer the simple hobbit of the Shire, but already beginning to partake of something greater and more terrible. Even as Sam watched, Frodo seemed to grow more translucent, more ethereal, as though he was beginning the transformation that would make him one with the very foundations of the world. "Tell them," called Frodo across the widening water, "tell them in the Shire that their gardens will bloom forever, and that the love they bear for growing things is part of what holds the world together." "I will," promised Sam, though his voice broke as he said it. And then Vingilota was moving, sailing swift as thought across the waters that separated the mortal world from the blessed realm. Sam stood in her bow, watching the shores of Eldamar fade into the distance, carrying with him the memory of Frodo's last smile and the weight of the message he bore. Behind him, in the crystal halls of Tol Eressëa, the final preparations were being made for a sacrifice that would echo through all the ages of the world, and a simple hobbit was preparing to become something greater and more terrible than any of the heroes of the elder day. The transformation had begun, and with it, the salvation of Middle-earth, though the price would be beyond all mortal reckoning. The return journey across the waters beyond the world passed differently than the voyage to the west had done. Where before Sam had felt his memories and attachments falling away like leaves in autumn, now they returned to him gradually, like flowers blooming after winter's end. Yet they came back changed, deepened somehow by the knowledge of what he had seen and done, weighted with the understanding of how precious and fragile all mortal joys truly were. Eonwe stood beside him at the ship's rail, his presence a comfort in the growing darkness that surrounded them. For as they drew nearer to Middle-earth, the herald's face grew ever more troubled, and his eyes reflected a concern that made Sam's heart heavy with foreboding. "What is it?" asked Sam at last, unable to bear the silence any longer. "What do you see that troubles you so?" "The unraveling proceeds more swiftly than we had feared," replied Eonwe, his voice like distant thunder. "Even now, as we speak, the barriers between order and chaos stretch thin. I can feel reality itself groaning under the strain, like a ship's timbers in a hurricane." Sam gripped the rail tighter, his knuckles white with tension. "Will we be too late? Perhaps. But if Frodo has begun the transformation as planned, there may yet be time to stabilize what remains. Though the cost..." The herald's voice trailed off, and he would say no more despite Sam's urgent questions. As Vingilota approached the Grey Havens, the change in Middle-earth became horribly apparent. The sea itself seemed wrong somehow, too dark beneath the surface, too cold despite the summer sun that shone overhead. Creatures moved in those depths that should not exist, things with too many eyes and not enough substance, beings that flickered in and out of reality like half-remembered nightmares. The harbor, when they reached it, was a scene of barely controlled chaos. Ships fled in all directions, their captains desperate to reach safer waters that might not exist anywhere in the wide world. The strange vessels that had appeared during Sam's departure were gone, but they had left behind them an atmosphere of wrongness that clung to the very stones of the quays. Círdan met them at the dock, but the ancient shipwright was greatly changed. His face, which had borne the weight of ages with quiet dignity, now showed the strain of forces that threatened to tear the very foundations of his knowledge apart. "Master Samwise," said he, clasping the hobbit's hand with desperate urgency, "thank Eru that you have returned, though I fear what news you bring may come too late to aid us." "What has happened?" asked Sam, though he dreaded the answer. "The cracks in reality have begun to spread," replied Círdan grimly. 3 days ago, the mountains themselves began to sing, not with the music of the Ainur, but with discordant harmonies that speak of things that should not be. The very stones cry out in languages that predate the awakening of the Eldar, and shadows move that cast themselves without objects to give them form. As if summoned by his words, a tremor ran through the ground beneath their feet, and for a moment, the harbor itself seemed to flicker, as though it existed in two places at once. In that brief instant of doubling, Sam glimpsed another Grey Haven, one built of black stone under a sky that burned with fires that gave no light, where creatures walked the docks that might once have been folk of Middle-earth, but were now something altogether other. "It grows worse by the hour," continued Círdan when the tremor passed. "The barriers between what is and what might be grow thinner with each passing moment. Soon, I fear, they will fail entirely, and then..." He shuddered and could not finish the thought. "Then we must make haste," said Eonwe, stepping forward with authority that made the very air around him thrum with power. "If Frodo Baggins has begun the transformation, the critical moment approaches when he must bind himself to the foundations of the world. We must be there to guide the process, lest even his sacrifice prove insufficient." They departed the Grey Havens within the hour, riding swift horses that Círdan provided, and taking the old roads that led most directly toward the eastern lands. But even as they rode, Sam could see that the very landscape of Middle-earth was beginning to change in ways both subtle and profound. Trees grew where no trees had been before, their branches reaching toward a sky that sometimes showed two suns or none at all. Rivers ran uphill for short stretches before remembering their proper course, and everywhere, hanging over the land like a pall, was the sense of watching, as though unseen eyes followed their progress from dimensions that existed parallel to their own. On the second day of their journey, they encountered a company of refugees fleeing westward from the lands that bordered the former realm of Mordor. Their leader was Faramir of Ithilien, but the prince bore little resemblance to the noble figure who had fought so valiantly in the War of the Ring. His face was gaunt with exhaustion and marked by lines of strain that spoke of horrors witnessed and barely survived. "Master Samwise," he cried upon recognizing the hobbit, "praise be to all the Valar that you yet live. We had feared the worst when word came that you had sailed west." "I've returned with help," replied Sam, gesturing toward Eowyn. "But tell me, what news from the eastern lands? How fare the people there?" Faramir's face grew dark with memory. "Not well, I fear. The very earth rebels against those who would dwell upon it. In Ithilien, the gardens I worked so hard to restore have become twisted things that bear fruit, which changes its nature even as you watch. The trees whisper in voices that are not their own, and the rivers run with water that reflects not the sky above, but scenes from other worlds entirely. And Minas Tirith still stands, though changed. The white tree has begun to bear leaves of silver and gold, beautiful to behold, but cold to the touch. And in the palantir of the steward, visions appear unbidden, not of Middle-earth as it is, but of Middle-earth as it might become if the barriers fail entirely." They rode together for the remainder of that day, Faramir's company swelling their numbers and providing additional protection against whatever dangers might await them on the road ahead. But as night fell, and they made camp in a dell that seemed relatively stable, Sam found his sleep troubled by dreams that were more than dreams. He saw Frodo as he was now, no longer the hobbit of the Shire, but something vast and luminous, stretched across the spaces between the stars. His consciousness had become a web of light that held the very fabric of reality together, each strand a thought, each intersection a moment of will that kept chaos at bay. But the strain was enormous, visible even in dreams as a trembling in the cosmic web that spoke of a burden almost too great to bear. "Hold on, Mr. Frodo," whispered Sam in his sleep. "Just hold on a little longer. We're coming." The next morning brought news that chilled them all to the bone. Riders from Minas Tirith overtook them on the road, bearing word that reality itself had begun to fail in the lands around the former site of the Black Gate. Entire sections of the countryside simply ceased to exist for hours at a time, leaving behind voids that hurt the eye to look upon and the mind to contemplate. "The king commands that all who are able should flee westward," reported the chief messenger. "He remains in the White City with a handful of volunteers, hoping to maintain some semblance of order. But even his will cannot hold back forces such as these. Then we must reach him swiftly," said Eowyn, and his voice carried such authority that the very horses seemed to quicken their pace in response. "For if the center fails, all is lost, regardless of what sacrifices are made." They rode then as they had never ridden before, changing horses at every settlement they passed, and stopping only when absolute necessity demanded it. Behind them, reports continued to arrive of reality, breaking down in ever-widening circles around the former site of the Black Gate. Entire cities flickered in and out of existence. Mountains moved in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and through it all, the sense of something vast and terrible stirring in the depths of chaos grew stronger with each passing hour. On the evening of the third day, they crested a hill and saw before them the white city of Minas Tirith. But even from a distance, they could tell that something was terribly wrong. The city flickered like a candle flame in a strong wind, sometimes appearing as they remembered it, sometimes showing as a ruin of black stone under a burning sky, and sometimes not appearing at all, leaving only empty air where the greatest fortress of Gondor should have stood. "Hurry!" urged Eunwë, his face grim with understanding. "The final moment approaches. If we do not reach the city before the barriers fail completely, then all our journeys will have been in vain." They spurred their exhausted horses down the hill toward the flickering citadel, racing against time itself as the very foundations of reality trembled beneath their feet. Behind them, the countryside began to dissolve into chaos. Ahead lay only the desperate hope that one small hobbit's sacrifice might yet prove sufficient to hold back the tide of destruction that threatened to engulf not merely Middle-earth, but all the circles of the world. The final test was at hand, and upon its outcome hung the fate of everything that had ever been, was, or ever could be. In the highest chamber of the Tower of Ecthelion, where once the Palantir of Minas Tirith had rested in its ancient setting, there now blazed a light that was not of Middle-earth. It pulsed with rhythms that matched no earthly heartbeat, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources, and illuminating corners that should not have existed in the architecture of mortal builders. King Elisar stood before this radiance, his face drawn with the strain of maintaining his will against forces that sought to tear apart the very concept of existence. Beside him stood Denethor. The pride and madness that had once defined him burned away by the naked reality of what they faced, leaving only a clarity of purpose that transcended all petty concerns of rule and dominion. "How much longer can you hold it?" asked Denethor, his voice barely audible above the harmonics that filled the air. Sounds that spoke of cosmic machinery grinding at the edges of perception. "Not much longer," replied Aragorn grimly. "The weight grows heavier with each moment. It's like trying to hold back the sea with my bare hands." He paused, sweat beading on his brow despite the chamber's chill. "Have there been any signs from the Watchers in the east?" Before Denethor could answer, a commotion arose in the courtyard below. Through the window, they could see riders approaching at desperate speed, their horses lathered with foam and their faces bright with urgency. Even from this height, Aragorn recognized the foremost figure. "Sam," he breathed, "he's returned." Within moments, footsteps echoed on the stairs, and the door to the chamber burst open to admit Sam, travel-stained and exhausted, but burning with purpose. Behind him came Eunwë, his true nature no longer hidden, but blazing forth in majesty that made the very stones of the tower ring like bells. "My Lord King," gasped Sam, falling to one knee despite his weariness, "I bring word from the Blessed Realm. Master Frodo has accepted the burden, and even now he works to renew the seal. But the strain is beyond what any mortal was meant to bear. We must aid him, or even his sacrifice will not suffice." Eunwë stepped forward, and his presence filled the chamber with light that cast no shadow. "The transformation is nearly complete," said he, his voice resonating with harmonies that spoke of powers beyond mortal comprehension. "But the final binding requires a focal point in Middle-earth itself, a place where will and spirit can anchor the renewed barrier to the foundations of the world." "What place?" asked Aragorn, though something in his heart already whispered the answer. "Here," replied the herald simply, "in this tower, where the Seeing Stones once connected all the realms of Middle-earth. The Palantir has been the focus of so much will and desire, so much hope and despair, that it has become a nexus where the barriers between worlds are thinnest. It is both the most dangerous place in all of Middle-earth and the only place where the binding can be completed." As if summoned by his words, the light in the chamber suddenly intensified, and within its radiance, shapes began to form. At first, they were indistinct, mere suggestions of presence that flickered at the edge of vision. But gradually, they solidified, taking on forms that those present recognized with wonder and terror in equal measure. There was Gandalf, but not as he had appeared in his incarnate form. This was Olorin in his true nature, a being of fire and light whose presence filled the chamber with warmth that had no physical source. Beside him stood figures from the elder days, Gilgalad in his might, Elendil bearing the shards of Narsil, and others whose names were sung in the oldest songs of the Eldar. And in the center of them all, growing ever more translucent, yet somehow more real than anything else in the chamber, was Frodo. But this was no longer the hobbit of the Shire. This was something vast and luminous, a consciousness that stretched across the spaces between the stars, bearing the weight of all existence upon shoulders that had become broader than worlds. Sam spoke this transformed being, and though the voice held harmonies that mortal ears were not meant to hear, within it could still be detected the simple warmth that had once characterized a gardener from Hobbiton. "My dear Sam, I'm so glad you made it back in time." "Master Frodo," whispered Sam, tears streaming down his face. "What have they done to you? What have you become?" "What I was always meant to be," replied the luminous figure gently. "A guardian, a keeper of the barrier, a small light to hold back the darkness." The figure seemed to smile, though its features were too ethereal to be certain. But even the smallest light can illuminate the darkest corners if it burns truly enough. The chamber began to tremble then, not with any earthly force, but with the strain of accommodating presences too great for mortal architecture to contain. Cracks appeared in the stone walls, and through them seeped light that belonged to no spectrum visible to ordinary eyes. "The moment comes," announced Yunwa urgently. "The barriers between order and chaos reach their breaking point. Now, Frodo Baggins, if ever you would save Middle-earth, you must bind yourself to this place and make it the keystone of all the renewed seal." "But what will that mean?" asked Denethor, his voice sharp with concern. "What will become of the city, of all who dwell here?" "Minas Tirith will become something more than a city," replied Olorin gravely. "It will become a sacred place, a point where the mortal world touches the divine. Those who dwell here will be blessed with long life and deep peace, but they will also bear the responsibility of guardianship. They will be the watchers who ensure that the seals remain strong, the keepers of the flame that holds back the dark." Aragorn straightened, his face set with the resolve that had carried him through all the trials of his long road to kingship. "Then we accept that burden gladly. If this is the price of peace for all Middle-earth, then we will pay it without complaint." "And I," added Denethor simply, "whatever my faults in life, let them be redeemed by service to this greater cause." The luminous figure that had been Frodo turned its attention to Sam, and in its ethereal features could be seen an expression of infinite tenderness. "And you, my dear Sam, what will you choose? The transformation will affect all who remain in the city when the binding is complete. You could leave now, return to the Shire, and live out your days in the peace that this sacrifice will purchase. No one would think less of you for it." Sam looked around the chamber at the faces of his friends and companions, at the beings of light who had gathered to witness this moment, at the cracks in reality that threatened to tear apart everything he had ever loved. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "I've followed you this far, Mr. Frodo. I don't see any reason to stop now. Besides," he added with a shadow of his old smile, "someone's got to keep an eye on you. Make sure you don't get yourself into too much trouble." The transformed being laughed then, and the sound was like silver bells and running water, and the first bird song of spring all woven together into a harmony of pure joy. "Oh, Sam, my dear, faithful Sam. Very well then, we'll see this through together, as we always have." The chamber filled with light then, light so brilliant that it should have been blinding, but somehow was not. Instead, it seemed to illuminate not just the physical space around them, but the very essence of those who witnessed, revealing truths that had been hidden in the depths of their hearts. Sam saw himself as he truly was, not a simple gardener from the Shire, but a being of courage and loyalty, whose love had become a force that could move the very foundations of the world. Aragorn beheld the true nature of his kingship, not merely rule over men, but stewardship of all growing things and guardianship of the peace that would follow. Denethor saw his pride and madness burned away, replaced by a wisdom that came from understanding his true place in the greater music. And through it all, the presence that had been Frodo grew ever more luminous, ever more vast, until it seemed to fill not just the chamber but all of Middle-earth, stretching out across the world like a net of light that touched every mountain and valley, every river and forest, every creature that walked or flew or swam in the wide world. "Now," spoke Ernwë, his voice cutting through the growing radiance like a sword of crystal, "the moment has come. Bind yourself, Frodo Baggins, to the heart of the world. Become the keystone that holds all things in their proper place. Accept the burden that will be yours until the ending of all things." And in that moment of supreme crisis, as reality itself hung in the balance between order and chaos, the simple hobbit, who had once carried a ring of power into the fires of Mount Doom, spoke a single word that echoed through all the circles of the world. "Yes." The light exploded outward then, racing across Middle-earth faster than thought, carrying with it the renewal of the ancient seals and the restoration of the barriers that held chaos at bay. Every crack in reality sealed itself. Every wound in the fabric of existence healed. Every shadow that had no right to exist was banished back to the void from whence it came. But in the Tower of Ithilien, the price of that salvation became manifest. For when the light faded, and those present could see clearly once more, they beheld a chamber transformed beyond all recognition, and understood that their lives too had been changed forever by the sacrifice they had witnessed. When the echoes of that great binding had faded, and the light had dimmed to a gentle radiance that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves, those who remained in the chamber found themselves in a place that was familiar yet utterly transformed. The Tower of Ithilien still rose above the Pelennor fields, still commanded the same magnificent view of the White Mountain and the distant sea. But it had become something more than mortal architecture could encompass. The walls now held depths that the eye could not fully fathom, as though each stone contained within it vistas of other realm, other possibilities that existed alongside the world of ordinary experience. The windows looked out not merely upon Middle-earth as it was, but upon Middle-earth as it could be, showing glimpses of forests that had never known the touch of axe or fire, of cities built in harmony with the living earth, of ships that sailed upon seas of starlight, between shores that had no name in any mortal tongue. And in the center of the chamber, where once the Palantir had rested in its ancient setting, there now stood something that defied easy description. It might have been a fountain of liquid light, or a tree whose branches reached into dimensions beyond counting, or simply a presence so vast and benevolent that mortal minds could only grasp fragments true nature. "Frodo," whispered Sam, approaching this manifestation with wonder and trepidation warring in his heart. The presence stirred, and when it spoke, its voice was everywhere and nowhere, emanating not from any physical source, but from the very air itself. "I am here, Sam. I am everywhere now, in every breath of wind that stirs the leaves, in every ray of sunlight that warms the earth, in every drop of rain that nourishes the growing things. I am the guardian who keeps watch in the deep places, the sentinel who stands at the gates between order and chaos." "Are you?" Sam struggled to find words for what he needed to ask. "Are you still you? Still Master Frodo?" The presence laughed, and the sound was like the music of the spheres, rendered audible to mortal ears. "I am what Frodo Baggins became when he chose to love the world more than himself. I am the gardener who tends the greatest garden of all, the one that encompasses everything that is and was and ever shall be." King Elisar stepped forward, his face marked by an awe that transformed his weathered feature. "And what of us? What have we become in accepting to remain here?" "You have become the Covenant Keepers," replied the presence that had been Frodo. "You are no longer merely mortals dwelling in a city of stone, but guardians of a sacred trust. You will live longer than the span allotted to ordinary men, and your understanding will deepen with each passing year. You will be the bridge between the mortal world and the eternal, helping others to understand that the barriers between them are not walls, but doorways. Denethor, who had stood silent through these exchanges, finally spoke, his voice filled with a humility that would have been foreign to him in his days of pride. "How many will share this burden with us? All who choose to," came the answer. "Word will go forth from this place to every corner of Middle-earth, carried not by messengers of flesh and blood, but by the wind itself. Those who hear the call and feel its truth in their hearts may come to Minas Tirith and accept the covenant. They will be welcomed regardless of their race or their past deeds, for in the face of eternity, all divisions become meaningless." Even as these words were spoken, Sam could feel something stirring in his own heart. Not a voice, exactly, but a knowing that came from somewhere deeper than thought. He understood now that Rose and his children would hear that call if they chose to listen, and that the choice would be theirs to make freely. The love between them had been transformed, but not diminished. It had become part of the great web of connection that held all things in harmony. "Will there be others like you?" asked Sam, gesturing toward the manifestation of his transformed friend. "Others who will take on the burden of keeping the barriers strong? In time, perhaps," replied the presence. "When the need arises, and hearts willing to make such sacrifice can be found. But for now, the renewed seals will hold. The barriers between order and chaos are stronger than they have ever been, warded not merely by power, but by love itself." In the days that followed, word of what had transpired in Minas Tirith spread across Middle-earth with a swiftness that seemed to transcend the ordinary means of communication. It traveled on the wind and in the song of birds, in the whisper of leaves and the murmur of streams, carrying with it an invitation that touched the hearts of all who were ready to receive it. From the Shire came Rose Gamgee with her children, her face bright with understanding, as she beheld what her husband had become, not lost to her, but transformed into something greater that encompassed their love without diminishing it. From Rohan came Yomer King, with a company of his riders, drawn by dreams of a green land where war would be only a memory, and the horses could run free beneath skies that never darkened with threat. From the forest came representatives of the Ents, their ancient wisdom recognizing in the transformed city a kinship with their own guardianship of the growing world. From the far north came some of the Dunedain, understanding that their long watch in the wild had prepared them for this greater vigil. Even from distant Lothlorien came word that the Lady Galadriel had looked in her mirror and seen the truth of what had been accomplished, and that she sent her blessing to all who had made such sacrifice possible. But perhaps most surprising of all was the arrival of a small company from the Grey Haven, led by Círdan himself. The ancient shipwright came not to join the Covenant, but to establish a new tradition. Ships would still sail west from the Grey Haven, carrying those who sought the peace of the Blessed Realm. But other vessels would now sail to Minas Tirith as well, bearing those who chose a different kind of service. "There is more than one way to touch the divine," explained Círdan as he stood in the transformed chamber, where Frodo's presence pulsed with gentle light. "Some find it in rest and reward, beyond the circles of the world. Others find it in eternal service within them. Both paths are blessed, and both are necessary." As the first year of the new covenant drew to a close, Sam found himself standing once again in the chamber at the heart of the tower, looking out through windows that showed not merely the physical landscape of Gondor, but the deeper truth that lay beneath the surface of all things. He could see the happiness of children playing in gardens that would never know blight or famine, the contentment of farmers whose fields would yield abundant harvests in season after season, the joy of lovers whose hearts were free from the shadow of war and loss. "No regrets, Sam?" asked the presence that had been Frodo, its voice carrying all the warmth and affection that had once belonged to the hobbit of Bag End. Sam smiled, his weathered face serene with a peace that transcended understanding. "How could I have regrets about this, Mr. Frodo? We've given everyone the chance to live the lives they were meant to live, to love without fear and grow without limit. If that's not worth whatever price we paid, then I don't know what would be. And Rose, the children? They understand. replied Sam simply. Rose says it's like having a husband who's become part of the very ground that makes the flowers grow. The children think it's the most natural thing in the world. They play games now where they ask you to make the sun shine just a little brighter, or to send a gentle rain when their seedlings are thirsty. The present stirred with what might have been laughter. And do I? Make the sun shine brighter for them? Maybe you do, said Sam with a grin. Or maybe they just see the world differently now, the way it really is beneath all the fear and sorrow. Either way, they're happy. We all are. As the seasons turned and the years passed, Minas Tirith became a place of pilgrimage for all the free peoples of Middle-earth. But it was not a solemn place of worship. Rather, it had become something like a great garden where mortals and immortals worked side by side to tend the growing things that were both literal and metaphorical. The city's gardens produced fruits and flowers of incredible beauty and sustenance, but they also produced ideas and dreams, songs and stories that spread throughout the world, carrying messages of hope and renewal. The libraries that had once contained only the histories and laws of Gondor now held also the collected wisdom of all the ages, growing daily as new understanding flowed from the fountainhead of transformed consciousness that dwelt at the city's heart. And always, threading through every aspect of life in the transformed city, was the quiet presence of love made manifest. Not merely the love between individuals, though that flourished as never before, but the great love that connected all things to all other things, the web of care and protection that held the world in harmony. Yet this was not the end of the story, for in the deep places of the earth, older powers stirred with interest at what had been accomplished. The echoes of the Black Gate had been silenced. The barriers between order and chaos had been renewed, but the very success of the endeavor had attracted attention from realms that lay even beyond the knowledge of the valor. In the deepest night, when even the guardian presence that had been Frodo Baggins turned its attention to the most distant corners of its vigilance, shadows gathered that were not shadowed, and voices whispered in the language that was spoken before the first word of the music gave form to the void. The great working had been accomplished, the world had been saved, and peace had been established that would endure until the ending of all things. But in achieving this victory, the Guardians of Middle-earth had revealed themselves to powers that dwelt in the spaces between space, and those powers had begun to take an interest in the little world where such wonders had been wrought. The true test was yet to come. In the 13th year after the Great Binding, when the peace of Middle-earth had settled into the rhythm of seasons turning and children growing tall beneath skies unmarked by shadow, the first sign of the greater watching came not to the covenant keepers in their transformed city, but to the humblest of places. It was young rosy lass Gamgee, Sam's daughter, who had grown to maidenhood in the blessed halls of Minas Tirith, who first noticed that her shadow sometimes moved independently of her body. At first she thought it merely a trick of the light, for the light in the city had always been strange and wonderful, casting shadows that sometimes showed not what was, but what could be. But as days passed, she began to perceive that the shadow was not merely moving differently, but watching her with an intelligence that was not her own. "Papa," said she to Sam one evening, as they tended the great garden that had grown around the base of the tower, "there's something in my shadow that doesn't belong there." Sam looked up from the malorn seedling he was planting, a gift from distant Lothlorien that would grow into a tree of silver bark and golden leaves. His weathered face, which had grown wise with the years, though it bore no lines of age, grew thoughtful as he studied his daughter's shadow where it fell across the earth. "Aye," said he quietly, "I see it too. There's a watching in it that comes from somewhere else." He straightened, his voice taking on the tone he had learned in council with kings and powers. "We'd best tell the others. This isn't something to face alone." Within the hour, the Covenant Keepers had gathered in the chamber at the heart of the tower, where the presence that had been Frodo maintained its eternal vigil. But even before Sam could speak of what he and his daughter had observed, that presence stirred with an urgency that set the very stones of the tower to humming in harmonies that spoke of vast distances and powers beyond mortal ken. "They have found us," spoke the Guardian's voice, and for the first time since the transformation, It carried a note of something that might have been concern. The watchers from beyond, those who dwell in the spaces between the spheres, where neither order nor chaos hold sway, but something else entirely rule. What are they? Asked King Elisar, his hand moving instinctively toward the sword at his side, though what weapon could avail against such beings was far from clear. They are curiosity incarnate, replied the present, beings of such ancient origin that they predate the music itself, who exist only to observe and understand. They are not evil as we comprehend evil, nor good as we know good. They simply are, and they watch, and they seek to comprehend all that transpires in the various spheres of existence. Denethor, whose understanding had deepened greatly in the years since his transformation, leaned forward with the intensity that had once characterized his study of the Palantir. And they have taken notice of us, of what we accomplished here? Indeed, the renewal of the barrier, the transformation of chaos into order, the binding of love itself into the foundations of reality. All of this has caught their attention. They see in our small world something unprecedented, something worthy of closer study. Rose Gamgee, who had come to represent all the families who had joined the covenant, spoke with the practical wisdom that was her inheritance. And what does that mean for us, for our children and their children? The presence was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, the covenant keepers could feel vast thoughts moving like tides across immeasurable distance. When the answer came, it carried within it depths of meaning that would take years to fully comprehend. It means that we have become part of something larger than we imagined. The barriers we renewed, the seals we strengthened, they were not merely local protections for Middle-earth alone. They are part of a vast network that spans all the spheres of existence, a web of connection that links every world where conscious beings have learned to love something greater than themselves. Sam felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. You're saying there are others? Other worlds like ours? Countless others, Sam. Some where the barriers have failed and chaos reigns supreme. Others where order has become so rigid that no growth or change is possible. And a precious few where the balance has been achieved, where love and will and sacrifice have created something that partakes of both stability and freedom. Yomer King, who had ridden to Minas Tirith from the Mark with a company of his finest riders and had never departed, spoke with the directness that was his nature. Then, what do these watchers want with us? Do they threaten what we have built here? They do not threaten in the way that Sauron threatened, or Saruman, or any of the dark powers we have faced before, replied the Guardian. But their watching itself changes things. To be observed by such beings is to become part of their study, to be drawn into questions and experiments that span eons. They will not destroy what we have built, but they may alter it in ways we cannot foresee. As if summoned by these words, the shadows in the chamber began to deepen and change, taking on qualities that had no relationship to the sources of light within the room. The walls themselves seemed to become transparent, revealing vistas that stretched away into distances that the mind could not properly encompass. Corridors of force and probability that connected realm to realm across the vast reaches of existence. And in those distances, shapes moved that were not quite shapes, presences that existed in too many dimensions for mortal perception to fully grasp. They approached not through space as mortals understood it, but through conceptual frameworks that bypassed the ordinary limitations of distance and time. "They come," whispered the Guardian Presence. "Prepare yourselves, but do not fear. They bring not destruction, but transformation, not death, but a kind of life that we have not yet imagined." The first of the Watchers materialized in the chamber not as a single entity, but as a plurality of possibilities, simultaneously tall and short, ancient and newly born, familiar and utterly alien. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of mathematics given audible form, beautiful in its precision but cold beyond any winter that Middle-earth had ever known. "Greetings, inhabitants of the sphere designated as Middle-earth," said this being, though the words seemed to arrive in their minds without passing through their ears. "We are the observant collective, the watchers from the spaces that lie perpendicular to existence. We have come to study the phenomenon you have created, the binding of chaos through willing sacrifice, the transformation of individual consciousness into cosmic guardianship." King Elisar stepped forward, his bearing regal despite the strangeness of the encounter. "We welcome you to our realm, though we confess we do not fully understand your nature or your purpose." "Understanding is not required," replied the Watcher, its form shifting through configurations that hurt the eye to follow. "Only cooperation. We wish to study your achievement, to understand how it might be replicated in other spheres where the barriers grow weak. Will you permit this examination?" It was Sam who answered, his voice carrying the simple honesty that had always been his greatest strength. "What would this examination involve? And what would happen to us during it?" "You would continue to exist as you do now," came the reply, "but your existence would become part of a greater experiment. Your joys and sorrows, your choices and their consequences, your very thoughts and dreams would be observed and catalogued. In return, you would gain access to knowledge gathered from countless other spheres, wisdom accumulated across eons of watching and study." The guardian presence that had been Frodo stirred then, and when it spoke, its voice carried an authority that made the Watcher's mathematical precision seem almost primitive by comparison. "And if we refuse this examination, what then?" The Watcher's form stabilized into something almost human, though its eyes held depths that spoke of vistas no mortal mind could navigate. "Refusal is possible, but once we have become aware of a phenomenon such as yours, that awareness cannot be withdrawn. Whether you cooperate or not, you will be watched. The only choice is whether that watching will be active or passive, participatory or merely observational." In the silence that followed this pronouncement, Sam found himself thinking of the garden outside the tower, where malorn trees grew beside apple trees from the Shire, where roses bloomed beside Eleanor flowers, where children of many races played together in the soft light that emanated from the stones themselves. All of it had been purchased with sacrifice and maintained by love. But now it seemed that even love was not enough to preserve the simple peace they had sought to create. "How long do we have to decide?" asked Rose, her practical nature asserting itself even in the face of such cosmic strangeness. "Time is a local phenomenon," replied the Watcher. "From your perspective, you have until the next turning of your season. From ours, the decision has already been made in several probable futures, though which one will manifest remains to be determined." And with those words, the being began to fade, becoming translucent and then transparent, until only a faint shimmer in the air remained to mark where it had stood. "Consider well," came its voice, now seeming to arrive from a great distance. "The choice you make will echo not merely through your own sphere, but across all the realms where consciousness struggles against the void. Choose wisely, guardians of the renewed barrier. Choose with full knowledge of what hangs in the balance." When the last trace of the Watcher's presence had vanished, the Covenant Keepers found themselves alone once more in their transformed chamber, but the weight of cosmic attention pressing down upon them made solitude feel like an illusion. They had achieved peace for Middle-earth, had created a sanctuary where love could flourish and growth could continue. But now they faced a choice that would determine whether that sanctuary could remain inviolate or would become part of something vast and alien that they could not control. The greatest test of all lay ahead, not a test of courage or strength, but a test of wisdom that would require them to choose between the peace they had won and the knowledge that might transform not merely their world, but all world forever. Spring came late to Minas Tirith in the 14th year after the Great Binding, though whether the delay was natural or influenced by the cosmic attention that pressed upon the city like a weight of stars, none could say. In the gardens that surrounded the tower, the malorn trees remained bare longer than they should have, their silver bark reflecting lights that came from no earthly source. while the children who played beneath their branches sometimes stopped mid-game to stare at shadows that moved without cause. The Covenant Keepers had spent the winter months in deep deliberation, but as the season turned toward warmth and new growth, they were no closer to consensus than they had been when the Watcher first appeared. Some, led by King Elisar, favored accepting the examination, arguing that the knowledge gained might help them protect not merely Middle-earth, but countless other worlds where the barriers grew weak. Others, notably Denethor and many of the families who had come from the Shire, feared that such cooperation would fundamentally alter the nature of what they had built, transforming their sanctuary into something cold and strange. It was Sam who had remained most troubled by the choice, for he alone among them had walked the path between worlds and understood the true cost of transformation. As he tended the gardens in the growing light of spring, he found himself talking to the presence that had been Frodo, sharing the doubts that weighed upon his heart. "I keep thinking about what we've built here," said he, as he worked the soil around a young apple tree that bore fruit of unprecedented sweetness. "It's beautiful, Mr. Frodo, and peaceful and full of love. But is it right to keep it for ourselves when there might be other worlds suffering the way Middle-earth was suffering? Other children who might be saved if we share what we've learned?" The Guardian presence stirred around him, manifesting not as light or voice, but as a deep sense of understanding that seemed to arise from the earth itself. "And yet," came the response, "if we allow ourselves to become subjects of study, will we still be ourselves? Will the love that holds this place together survive being catalogued and analyzed by beings who experience existence so differently from us?" "I don't know," replied Sam honestly. "That's what troubles me most. I've never been one for complicated decisions. Always seemed to me that doing the right thing was usually clear enough, if you just looked at it straight. But this is not about right and wrong, Sam. This is about what we choose to become, and that is always the hardest choice of all." As they spoke, young Rosie Lass approached through the garden paths, her face bright with the excitement of discovery. In her hands, she carried a flower unlike any that had grown in Middle-earth before. Its petals seemed to shift between dimensions, showing depths that the eye could not quite follow, while its fragrance carried hints of mathematics and music intertwined. "Papa," said she, holding up the strange bloom, "look what I found growing by the fountain. It wasn't there yesterday, I'm sure of it." Sam took the flower gently, marveling at its alien beauty. As his fingers touched the petals, images flashed through his mind, visions of other worlds, where similar flowers bloomed, tended by beings who were not quite human, but shared the same capacity for wonder and love that he saw in his daughter's eyes. "They're showing us," he said quietly, "the Watchers. They're showing us what we might become part of." The Guardian presence pulsed with something that might have been excitement or concern, or what might become part of it. "The influence flows both ways, Sam. If we join their experiment, we will change them as much as they change us." That evening, as the sun set behind the White Mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, a great council convened in the chamber at the heart of the tower. Not merely the Covenant Keepers of Minas Tirith attended, but representatives from every corner of Middle-earth that had been touched by the renewal of the barrier. From the Shire came Merry and Pippin, now grown into their full dignity as leaders of their people, but still retaining the essential warmth that had made them beloved companions. From Rohan came Éowyn the White Lady, her wisdom deepened by years of peace and healing. From the northern realms came rangers who had served as watchers on the borders of the wild, and from the seas came representatives of the mariners who had learned to read the new patterns in wind and wave. Even from distant Lothlorien came word, carried by one of Galadriel's swans, that spoke with the lady's own voice. "The choice before you echoes through all the circles of time. Choose not for yourselves alone, but for all who will come after. Choose with knowledge that some gifts cannot be taken back, and some doors, once opened, cannot be closed." When all had gathered, and all voices had been heard, King Elisar rose to speak, his face marked by the weight of decision, but his voice clear and strong. "We have heard wisdom from many sources," said he, "and we have weighed the benefits and the dangers of the choice before us. But in the end, we must decide not with our minds alone, but with our hearts. What does love itself counsel us to do?" It was then that the most unexpected voice spoke up, that of little Tom Gamgee, Sam's youngest son, who had grown to boyhood in the transformed city and had never known a world without the presence of the guardian who had been Frodo. "Uncle Frodo," said the boy, addressing the luminous presence directly, "what would you do if you were still just a hobbit, not a guardian or a cosmic force or anything grand like that, just Mr. Frodo from Bag End, who liked his garden and his books and his friends?" The chamber fell silent at this question, for the child had cut through all the elaborate reasoning and cosmic implications to the heart of the matter. When the guardian presence answered, its voice carried all the warmth and simple wisdom that had once belonged to a hobbit who had volunteered to carry a ring into darkness. "I would ask myself," came the gentle reply, "whether the choice would make it easier or harder for people to love each other. And if it made it easier, then I would say yes, whatever the cost to myself. For love is the only thing that truly mattered in the end." Sam felt tears spring to his eyes at these words, for they carried him back across all the years to a garden in Hobbiton, where a simple gardener had first pledged his loyalty to a friend in need. "Then that's our answer," said he, rising to stand beside the king. "We say yes, we join their experiment, whatever it may bring. Because if there's even a chance that what we've learned here can help others find their way to love and peace, then we have to take it." One by one, the other covenant keepers rose to stand with him, until the entire assembly was on its feet in a gesture of unanimous consent. And as they stood, the chamber began to fill with light, not the harsh illumination of the Watcher's presence, but the warm, golden radiance that had always emanated from the guardian who had been Frodo. "Then it is decided," spoke that beloved presence. "We open our doors to the cosmic experiment. We allow ourselves to become part of something larger, in the hope that what we have built here will serve as seed for gardens that span the stars themselves." No sooner had these words been spoken than the air in the chamber began to shimmer and change. The walls became transparent once more, revealing the vast network of connections that linked world to world across the endless reaches of existence. And through that network, Sam could see other chambers like their own, other councils making similar choices, other guardians accepting the responsibility of cosmic love. The Watchers materialized around them, no longer single entities, but a collective presence that encompassed perspectives from across the spectrum of existence. When they spoke, their voice carried harmonies that transformed the mathematics of the cosmos into something approaching music. "Welcome," they said, "to the greater experiment. You will retain your identity, your love, your essential nature, but you will also become part of something vast, a network of consciousness that spans the spheres, dedicated to understanding how love itself can be cultivated and sustained across all the realms of existence." As the transformation began, Sam felt his consciousness expanding beyond the confines of his individual awareness, touching other minds across impossible distances while remaining firmly rooted in the love that had brought him to this moment. He was still Sam Gamgee of Hobbiton, still the gardener who had followed his master into darkness and back into light. But he was also something more, a node in a network of care that encompassed worlds beyond counting. Through that network, he felt the presence of others like himself, beings who had chosen love over safety, growth over stasis, hope over certainty. And in that feeling, he understood at last the true nature of the echoes that had drawn the Watcher's attention. They were not echoes of the Black Gate or any single event, but echoes of love itself, reverberating across the cosmos and awakening similar love in every world they touched. "And so," spoke the guardian presence that had been Frodo, its voice now harmonizing with the voices of countless other guardians across the stars, "the garden grows, not merely in one world, but in all world, not merely for one people, but for all people. The barriers are renewed, the seals are strengthened, and love itself becomes the foundation upon which reality rests. In the gardens outside the tower, the malern trees burst into bloom all at once, their leaves of gold and silver catching light that came not from any single sun, but from the combined radiance of worlds beyond counting. Children from a dozen different races ran laughing beneath their branches, while above them, shadows danced that belonged to no earthly shapes, but spoke of wonders yet to be discovered. The echoes of the Black Gate had been silenced at last, not by force or magic, but by the simple choice to love more than fear, to hope more than despair, to give more than take. And in that choice, they had found not an ending but a beginning, the first notes of a new music that would grow and strengthen until it encompassed all the spheres of existence, binding them together not in chains of servitude, but in the golden threads of willing love. The great experiment had begun, and at its heart stood a simple truth that even the cosmic watchers had not fully understood until now, that love itself was the greatest power in all the realms of existence, and that those who served it faithfully would find themselves part of something infinitely larger and more beautiful than they had ever dared to imagine. In the end, the humblest hearts had proven to be the strongest foundation, and the garden that had begun in a single shire had grown to encompass the stars themselves. Thus ends the tale of the echoes of the Black Gate, and begins the greater story of how love conquered not merely darkness, but the very fear of transformation itself, teaching all who would listen that the greatest adventures are not those that lead us away from home, but those that show us how home can grow, to embrace all the wonders of creation.